The foreclosure notice came on a Tuesday, a crisp white envelope that might as well have contained a death sentence. I sat at my kitchen table, the morning light streaming through windows that would soon no longer be mine, and let the tears flow freely. At 62, I was about to lose the home where I'd lived for 30 years, raised my children, and buried my husband. 3 years of struggling after David's death had led to this moment. His medical bills, despite insurance, had been catastrophic. The part-time library job I'd taken after early retirement from teaching couldn't begin to cover the mortgage on this sprawling Victorian that had once seemed like such a good investment. My modest savings were depleted, and my children, dealing with their own financial challenges across the country, couldn't help. I had 90 days to vacate, to dismantle 3 decades of life and find somewhere else to begin again. The thought was so overwhelming that for 1 full day, I simply sat and stared at the walls, paralyzed by grief and fear. On the second day, I forced myself to make a plan. I would need an apartment, something small and affordable. I would need to sell or give away most of my possessions, and I would need to say goodbye to my garden, the 1/4 acre of flowers, herbs, and vegetables that had been my solace since David died. It was the garden I mourned most as I began packing books and sorting through clothes. May was just beginning, the perennials I'd planted over the years beginning their annual show, irises unfurling. Our head gardener, James, is moving to Arizona next month to be near his daughter. We need someone to take his place, someone with extensive knowledge of plants, good organizational skills, and a passion for teaching others. I blinked, uncertain I was understanding her. And you're offering this position to me? Someone you've never met? Margaret smiled. I've been watching your garden for 15 years, Eleanor. Anyone who can coax those kinds of blooms from our difficult soil knows what they're doing. And I called Ellen at the library. Hope you don't mind. She speaks very highly of your work ethic and how you've initiated several successful programs there. The job includes a small apartment in the caretaker's cottage on the property, she continued. It's nothing fancy, just 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a living area. But the garden would be right outside your door. The position comes with a modest salary, enough to live on simply if you're careful. I sat back, stunned by the unexpected lifeline being extended to me. I don't know what to say, I admitted. I've only ever gardened for myself, for pleasure. I've never managed a community project. But you are a teacher for 30 years, Margaret countered. You know how to organize, how to explain things, how to inspire people. The gardening knowledge you already have. The rest you can learn. She sipped her tea, her eyes fixed on mine over the rim of the cup. At least come see the place before you decide. That afternoon, Margaret showed me around the community garden. Neat raised beds filled with burly vegetables, a small orchard of apple and pear trees, a section devoted to cutting flowers, and a greenhouse where seedlings were started. The cottage was indeed small, but well-maintained, with windows that overlooked the entire garden. As the late afternoon sun slanted across the orderly plots, I could almost imagine myself living there, starting over. The board would need to interview you formally, Margaret said as we walked back to her car. But as president, I have considerable influence. She smiled a bit mischievously. And I've already told them about you. They're quite interested. Why are you doing this for me? I asked suddenly. We're practically strangers. Margaret was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. 20 years ago, I lost everything in a divorce. My house, half my retirement savings, my sense of security. I was 58 and terrified. She met my gaze directly. Someone helped me then, offered me a job and a place to live when I needed it most. This is me passing that forward. 3 weeks later, I moved into the caretaker's cottage at the Highland Park Community Garden. My massive Victorian furniture had been sold, along with most of my possessions. What remained fit comfortably in the small space: my grandmother's rocking chair, my favorite books, David's collection of bird carvings, and of course, my gardening tools. The transition wasn't easy. I missed my home, my garden, the familiar creaks of the old house at night. The cottage felt temporary, borrowed, like I was living in someone else's life. The community garden, with its many members and their varying levels of expertise, intimidated me at first. Who was I to tell Mrs. Chen, who had been growing vegetables for 40 years in 3 different countries, how to space her tomato plants? What could I possibly teach Mr. Rodriguez, whose salsa garden produced the most aromatic cilantro I'd ever encountered? But as June bloomed into July, I found my place in this patchwork community. I wasn't there to dictate, but to facilitate, to make sure tools were available and in good repair, to coordinate the watering schedule during dry spells, to help newcomers lay out their plots, to organize the harvest donations for the food pantry. You're doing wonderfully, Margaret assured me one evening as we sat on the cottage's small porch, watching fireflies rise from the garden like slow-motion fireworks. Everyone appreciates how you've organized the tool shed and started that notebook of gardening tips. James was excellent with plants, but terrible with people. You're good with both. I still feel like I'm making it up as I go along, I admitted. Aren't we all? Margaret laughed. That's the secret no one tells you about aging. We all still feel like we're improvising, even in our 70s and 80s. By August, as the garden reached its productive peak, tomatoes weighing down vines, zinnias exploding in riotous color, beans needing daily picking, I realized I had stopped thinking of the cottage as temporary. I had planted herbs and pots on the porch steps. I had hung curtains and arranged my books just so. I had, without consciously deciding to, begun to make a home. The community garden members had become something like family, eccentric, occasionally difficult, but fundamentally kind-hearted. There was Sophia, an 80-year-old Greek woman who brought me dolmides and told stories about the village where she had learned to garden from her grandmother. There was Tyler, a tattooed young man who worked night shifts at the hospital and came to tend his plot in the early mornings, growing all purple vegetables for reasons he never fully explained. There was the Chen family, 3 generations working together on a massive plot bursting with bok choy, bitter melon, and Chinese long beans. And there was Margaret, stopping by almost daily, ostensibly to check on garden operations, but really, I suspected, to ensure I was adapting well to my new circumstances. She had become a friend, her direct manner and dry humor a welcome presence in my life. One September evening, as I was locking the tool shed, I noticed a silver-haired man I didn't recognize examining the dahlias near the garden entrance. Tall, with a slight stoop to his shoulders, he had the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "Can I help you?" I asked, approaching him. He turned, and I was met with the kindest blue eyes I'd ever seen, crinkled at the corners from years of smiling. "Just admiring these," he said, gesturing to the dinner plate-sized blooms. "Bishop of Llandaff, aren't they? Magnificent specimens." "You know your dahlias," I observed, impressed by his identification of the specific variety. "I should," he replied with a smile. "I grew them commercially for 30 years before retiring. Robert Fletcher," he added, extending his hand. "Eleanor Sullivan, I'm the head gardener here." We shook hands, his grip firm and warm. "Ah, you're Eleanor," he said, his smile widening. "Margaret's told me about you. I serve on the garden board, but I've been visiting my son in Colorado for the past 2 months. Just got back yesterday." "Margaret's mentioned you too," I replied, though this wasn't entirely truthful. Margaret had occasionally referenced a Robert who grew spectacular dahlias, but she had never suggested I might meet him. "Have you had dinner?" he asked suddenly. "There's a new Thai place on Main Street I've been wanting to try. Unless you have plans, of course." I hesitated. I hadn't been to dinner with a man since David died. The thought made me acutely conscious of my gardening clothes, my hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, my hands still bearing traces of soil despite a thorough washing. I must look a fright, I said, gesturing vaguely at myself. Robert's gaze was warm, appreciative in a way I hadn't experienced in years. You look like a woman who spent the day doing what she loves, he said simply. I can't think of anything more attractive than that. The Thai restaurant was small and welcoming, with just a dozen tables and soft lighting that made everyone look their best. Over spicy basil chicken and coconut soup, Robert told me about his life, his dahlia farm in a nearby county, his late wife Anne, who had died of breast cancer 8 years earlier, his son in Colorado who had recently made him a grandfather for the first time. And now I'm trying to figure out what the next chapter looks like, he concluded. The farm is leased to a young couple who are doing wonderful things with it. My house feels too big for just me. I'm on half a dozen boards and committees, but that only fills so many hours. I understand, I said. After David died, I rattled around in our house like the last pea in a can. The garden became my salvation. And now, strangely enough, losing that house has led me here, to a new kind of garden and a new purpose. Margaret mentioned your situation, Robert said, his tone sympathetic but not pitying. She has a knack for matching people with the right opportunities. She's the one who suggested I join the garden board after Anne died, when I was at loose ends. As we shared a mango sticky rice dessert, I found myself telling Robert things I hadn't spoken of to anyone. How I sometimes woke in the night, gripped by fear that I had failed somehow, that losing the house was a reflection of poor planning or bad choices. How I missed the privacy of my own garden, even as I embraced the communal nature of my new role. How I worried about becoming a burden to my children as I aged. The hardest part of starting over at our age, Robert reflected, is feeling like we're supposed to have everything figured out by now. That uncertainty and new beginnings are for the young. Exactly, I agreed, relieved that he understood. Everyone talks about reinvention like it's exciting, but no one mentions how terrifying it is to reinvent yourself when you have fewer years ahead than behind. And yet, he said, his blue eyes intent on mine, what's the alternative? To stop growing? To decide we're finished becoming who we're meant to be? He shook his head. I can't accept that. Neither Anne nor David would want that for us. By the time he walked me back to my cottage, the moon was rising over the garden, silvering the plants and casting long shadows across the paths. We stood on my small porch, suddenly awkward like teenagers after a first date. I've enjoyed this evening, Robert said. Would you consider having dinner with me again? Perhaps Saturday? I'd like that, I said, surprised by how much I meant it. As fall deepened into winter, Robert became a regular presence in my new life. We had dinner twice a week, took drives to view the autumn foliage, attended the community theater's holiday production. He helped me winterize the garden, showing me techniques for protecting perennials that I, despite my experience, had never known. You're glowing these days, Margaret observed as we worked together on the garden's spring planting schedule in early December. Robert's good for you. We're just friends, I protested. Though I knew my flushed cheeks betrayed me, Margaret gave me a knowing look. At our age, friendship is the most important foundation. The rest can follow if it's meant to. She was right, of course. Robert and I moved toward romance with the careful deliberation of people who have loved and lost before, who understand both the value and the vulnerability of opening one's heart again. Our first kiss came on New Year's Eve. As we stood on the footbridge over the half-frozen mill pond, the distant sounds of the town's celebration carrying through the clear, cold air. I never thought I'd feel this way again, he confessed, his arms around me, his breath warm against my hair. Neither did I admitted. I thought that part of my life was over. It seems we were both wrong, he said, and kissed me again. Spring arrived with its familiar promises of renewal. though this year everything felt different. The community garden awakened under my care, beds being prepared, seedlings started in the greenhouse, fruit trees pruned and ready for blossoming. But my personal life was blossoming too, in ways I hadn't anticipated when I moved into the cottage the previous spring. Robert had sold his too-large house and bought a charming bungalow just a few blocks from the garden. We spent evenings planning a new garden for his backyard, drawing designs and debating the merits of various plants with the pleasant intensity of people who share a passion. "You should combine households," Margaret suggested bluntly one day, as we worked together dividing hostas. "That cottage is perfectly sized for one person, but cramped for two, and Robert's place has plenty of room for both of you." "We've only known each other 8 months, I protested. "That seems awfully fast." Margaret sat back on her gardening stool, fixing me with her direct gaze. "Eleanor, at 76 and 63 respectively, you and Robert don't have the luxury of moving at a conventional pace. If you love each other, if you make each other happy, why wait?" "I'm afraid," I admitted softly. "What if it doesn't work out? I'd be giving up my position here, my independence. Starting over again, at my age." "Life is giving you a second chance," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "Those don't come along every day, especially in our later years. Sometimes courage isn't about facing danger. It's about facing joy and allowing yourself to embrace it fully." That evening, I told Robert about my conversation with Margaret. We were sitting on his porch swing, watching twilight settle over his newly planted garden, where we had spent the day installing a pergola for roses and clematis to climb. "What do you think?" he asked, his arm warm around my shoulders. "Is Margaret right? Are we being overly cautious?" I considered the question carefully. When I lost my house last year, I thought I was losing everything: my home, my garden, my sense of identity. Instead, I found a new purpose at the community garden. I found friends who have become like family. And I found you. I turned to face him directly. "I'm not afraid of change anymore. I'm not afraid of beginning again, as long as it's with you." Robert's smile was radiant in the gathering dusk. "Then move in with me, Eleanor. Help me make this garden as beautiful as the one you left behind. We'll plant those Duchess de Brabant roses you miss so much. We'll put in peonies and irises and all the flowers that tell your story. And dahlias," I added, returning his smile. "Bishop of Llandaff, if I recall correctly." "Definitely dahlias," he agreed, pulling me closer. "A whole new garden for our second chance at life." 1 year to the day after I received the foreclosure notice, I handed the keys to the caretaker's cottage to Sophia's granddaughter Marina, a recent horticulture graduate who had been my apprentice through the spring. She would make an excellent head gardener, bringing youthful energy and new ideas to the position I had helped shape. "You'll still be around, right?" Marina asked anxiously. "On the board and helping with the educational programs?" "Of course," I assured her. "The garden will always be part of my life. It gave me a home when I needed one most." That evening, Robert and I hosted a garden party in our backyard, a housewarming of sorts, though I'd been living in the bungalow for 2 months. Margaret was there, of course, along with the Chens, Tyler from the night shift, Sophia and her extended family, and dozens of other friends from the community garden. As twilight fell and Japanese lanterns glowed among the newly planted beds, I found myself standing with Margaret near the budding rose arbor. "Happy?" she asked, her direct gaze as penetrating as ever. "Very," I said honestly, though sometimes I still can't believe how much my life has changed in just 1 year. Margaret smiled, satisfaction evident in her expression. Gardens are like that, always changing, always offering new life if you're willing to do the work, take the risk, plant the seed. She patted my arm. "You were meant for this second blooming, Eleanor. Some of the most beautiful flowers are the ones that open later in the season." As if on cue, Robert appeared at my side, his arm slipping naturally around my waist. "Are you two solving the world's problems over here?" he asked. "Just admiring your garden," Margaret replied, "and the gardeners who are bringing it to life." Later, as our guests departed and the night deepened around our new home, Robert and I stood together beneath the pergola we had built, now twined with the green promise of climbing plants that would in time create a living canopy above us. "I was thinking," Robert said, his voice thoughtful in the darkness, "about what you lost and what you found. About how sometimes we have to let go of one garden to discover another." "Are you getting philosophical in your old age?" I teased gently. He laughed, pulling me close. "Maybe so. Or maybe I'm just profoundly grateful that your path led you to the community garden and to me." I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Above us, stars punctuated the velvet sky, as ancient and constant as they were the night I received the foreclosure notice, and thought my life was ending rather than beginning anew. "Grateful," I repeated softly. "Yes, that's exactly the word for what I'm feeling too." Around us, the young garden waited in the darkness, each plant a promise, each seed a possibility, the whole of it a testament to second chances and the courage to embrace them, no matter when in life they arrive.